Archaeology and history usually go together. So if Greg Lynn's exhibition claims to be archaeological, what I'd like to do tonight is to talk a little bit about the history of the digital and the way the digital technology has impacted architecture. Actually, more than a single narrative, what we see emerging are a multiplicity of narratives regarding the digital in architecture, hence these histories of the digital. The plural might have to do with the complexity of the digital itself. And in the first part of the lecture, I'd like to discuss a little bit these questions. What is the digital? What are we confronted with? And to try to outline how complex, actually, and layered this is. In the second part, I will evoke where we are in terms of historiography, what has been covered, and what still remains to be done. Although histories of the digital in architecture constitute a rapidly expanding field, actually it's much easier these days to find PhD students dealing with the history of the digital, whereas 18th century scholars are becoming a kind of endangered species. Nevertheless, a lot remains to be done. As Bernard Tschumi and others actually have argued last week, the digital raises fundamental questions regarding the architectural discipline itself. So in the third part of the lecture, I will try to evoke some of these questions of foundation of the discipline. Indeed, historians are obliged to confront them, and from history, one is thus led to a series of theoretical questions. I will then make a very brief development on the urban dimension and try to conclude on the need to rethink perhaps the agenda of history of architecture because of the digital. If the CCA exhibition ultimately revolves around the need to rethink curatorial strategies, my own point will be the need to rethink the ambition and role of history, both in academic terms and with respect to design education. So I'm aware that this is a relatively complex itinerary, but the subject is once again pretty complicated. So my ambition here tonight is not to deliver my latest thought on the digital, rather, since it's part of a seminar for students, to contribute, hopefully, to the clarification of some of the issues that are at stake. And after all, this is a week supposed to be devoted to method. So I'll begin by what is the digital? As Stan Allen remarked in his lecture on Monday, the term digital may be misleading if we confuse it with the sole use of computers. The digital is indeed a pervasive condition, inextricably, and I'll come back to this issue in a minute, technological and cultural. For all that, I'm not sure that we can limit the study of the digital in architecture to only computing. For architecture, it has actually relations with a whole array of dimensions linked to the pervasive digital world in which we live. So the first thing probably, and this is where I'm really an historian, and I suppose coming right after Oosterhuis, the contrast will be quite severe, but I suppose this is part of what this week is about. I'd like to show how the our digital present is actually the result of a complex series of historic strata. So let me reassure you, I'm not Mario Carpo, in case you did not notice it. So I don't believe we have to go back as early as the Renaissance. But I do actually believe that we have to go pretty early, because at least at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, with the emergence of a society dependent on massive quantity of information. This is now a pretty well-documented subject among historians. Basically, the fact that what was often called the second industrial revolution is actually as much an information revolution, in which society begins to need and to manipulate larger and larger quantity of data for administration, business, all kinds of purposes. This is the prudential insurance company offices at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and of course what is produced here is data, kilometers of data. So in many ways, one should consider that it's not the computer that has given birth to the society of information. Rather, it is the emergence of the society of information, let's say sometime between 1880 and 1920, that has made necessary at some point the invention of a machine like the computer. The best proof, perhaps, is that actually the institutional, not the technological, but the institutional ancestor of the computer is the tabulating machine, which is invented in the 1880s. And let me remind you that the tabulating machine, which is the first machine to use punch cards, is actually what IBM produces until the Korean War. So, and most of the big business that will go into computer manufacturing will actually be tabulating machines company. So once again, this is perhaps, it's probably the society of information that made something like the computer necessary. And this should probably represent a good antidote against the temptation of technological determinism. So second phase, so that's really the first phase, sometimes, let's say, between the 1880s and the 1930s. Second phase, the invention of the computer proper, and the beginning of, the modern computing world. And this, as you all know, this is not the ENIAC, I've chosen UNIVAC because it was a color picture, but basically, this happens in between the early 1940s and 1950s, 1960s. The invention of the computer and all that goes with it, and we could say that it goes up to the 1970s or something like that, or 1980s. The third phase, we are now in the middle of the third phase, which is perhaps a bit difficult, more difficult to characterize, but which is marked by a series of key evolution. First evolution from early 1970s, ARPANET, and then later what will become the internet. The rising, so first thing, the rising importance of communication between machines as well as between men and machines. The internet is part of this evolution, but a part only. Second evolution, the more and more ubiquitous presence of computing. Something that had been foreseen by someone like Mark Weiser, who was then director of the computer science lab at Xerox PARC in his 1991 article, The Computer of the 21st Century. We are now, it has not yet reached this stage, but the cell phone is part of this ubiquitous computing thing. We have chips from the cell phone to the dishwasher and to many other appliances, so we are beginning to live in that. Third phenomenon probably that characterizes what has happened, the individual turn. The social networks, the Web 2.0, etc., are very emblematic of this turn. No need to go back to the Facebook, etc. But this is something to note. This is something that goes beyond digital culture. A sociologist like Ulrich Beck has insisted on this dimension very early on in books like his 1986 Risk Society. The link between what was happening in the field of the digital and the individual dimension was, as for it, really underlined by Nicolas Negroponte in Being Digital, which is very much about the opposition between the mass information age and the individual customized information age that he characterized as a digital condition. That said, and to complicate a little bit the picture, I've tried to show in the various books I've written on this question that actually the rise of the individual in relation to information is a much more ancient story. That actually it's one of the threads that link the three episodes I've been doing, and this is one of the reasons I got interested at some point in cyborgs as a kind of recurring mythological figure of the information age. So this is complicated. 3 layers at least. Now, to try to get simpler idea, one could be tempted to go to the technology itself to get clearer ideas. But the technology, to be true, possesses the same layered structure. So you may have understood by now that my purpose is to show you that the digital was always historic in some ways, was always deeply historical. First, something to note, we have the legacy of machines from the past. If the tabulating machines are gone for good, the ghost of the typewriter is still a little bit with us, not to speak of the phone, etc. And so that's one thing. Second thing, the diversity of the various pieces of equipment that surround us is even more spectacular. The digital age, as we all know, is as much the age of the smartphone as it is the age of the computer. And actually, one of the questions today would be, what is an architecture of the age of the smartphone? as much as an architecture of the age of the computer. And soon we'll have the Google glasses, and I took an early version just to relate to the cyborg issue. Okay, and we have the tablets and so many other things. So a related question is whether more than the machines themselves, what truly matters are their connection. Because of their dependence on networks, some scholars have evoked their quasi-object status. It's, by the way, and one of the, it's true that being connected to the internet, a machine that is connected to the internet is no longer a traditional machine, it's a terminal. So this is a bit different than the traditional individual thing. It's, by the way, for me, striking throughout the week and a half that we've had how little has been said on the internet, which has massively transformed the architectural profession. Think of all these transcontinental offices that could, one of my colleagues who is soon to come, I suppose, Rahul Mehrotra, has an office, is in Massachusetts, and has an office in Mumbai. Without the internet, this would not work. So it has transformed a lot the practice. So now, if we limit itself, let's even try to be simple. Let's try to limit ourselves to the computer. But then we discover that even the computer is actually a multi-layered reality. When the computer appeared, it was supposed to be a computing machine. But then, very quickly, one discovered, and this dates almost from von Neumann, that the computer was actually a machine that could, in a certain sense, think. And that was the big theme at the time of the cybernetics, etc. Then, almost around the same time, began to appear the idea that the computer was a machine that enabled you to see. And the SAGE anti-missile system, the computer network, is actually meant to enhance your vision of missile bombs, etc., to see the world in a certain light. And then also what appeared is the computer as a machine to fabricate, and from the early CNC machines like this one up to the present. Then, and this is probably the deepest characteristic of the digital age, the computer has become a machine that is linked to a profound evolution of our senses and their relation, what is often referred to as the sensorium. The computer has not only reformed our vision, for anyone less than 10 years old, a non-clickable image is almost a scandal. So the zooming out and in, it has become a natural visual condition. So the computer has reformed vision, it has reformed also our sense of the touch. Think of the first time I saw somebody doing that was at the beginning of the iPhone. Now everybody is used to this kind of gesture. It has reformed a lot of our senses, and it's reforming also music, as we know, but also take even the perfume industry is more and more computer dependent. So to finish, fabrication is back with the utopia of universal printing. So even a machine like the computer, they are actually a multi-layered interpretation. So a way to summarize what I just said would be to consider that we're no longer facing traditional machines, not even quasi-object, but a seamless technological environment, something like an ecology with deep historical structures. What this situation suggests, once again, is that instead of having something that is purely technological, we have something which is at the deepest level, social and cultural. And this is something historians have dealt a lot with, especially in science and technology, that the computer is as much a perspective on the social world than a machine. This is what, for example, Paul Edwards, historian of science, has tried to argue. So, and for me, one of my recurring themes from book to book, I've devoted 3 books to this question, is the centrality of the question of the subject, of the individual. That actually the digital age, but from the information age to the digital age, one of the constant questions has been the question of the subject. And this is one of the threads that link the 3 books that I have devoted to the rise of digital culture and its impact on architecture in the city, from La Ville Territoire des Cyborgs, which was the first one of the series, to the most recent on Ornament. It's always the recurring question: what is the subject of the city, of the new digital city and the new digital architecture? So I'll stop with the autobiography there and try now to say a few words about where are we in terms of history of the digital in architecture. So where are we? So throughout the 20th and early 21st century, there have been multiple interactions between architecture and phenomena like the rise of information, the development of the computer, and of course the advent of the digital age. And these connections have been documented by historians, but this is something I'd like to insist to, pretty unevenly. The problem is not that we don't have histories of the digital, we have actually a ton of them. The problem is that they are very unevenly distributed in terms of time, in terms of period. There have been, for instance, relatively few studies of the early influence of the rise of the information-based society on architecture. Although these relations do exist, let's think of all the spaces devoted to information in early 20th century architecture. I couldn't find, unfortunately, but there is this beautiful catalog room in the Ghent Library, University Library, and there are so many spaces for information. But let's also think of all these early control rooms, like here, this is an Edison Company control room in which what you see from the world is actually information. Here, voltage in the system. And you know, this is a theme also in Metropolis. What you see from the office of the director is information, not the suffering of people. So the bulk of the history of the digital that have been written so far is concentrated on the period that goes roughly from the 1940s, 1950s to the advent of postmodernism. And there we have a lot of studies. Even if we're far from knowing everything, we have a lot of things. Reinhold Martin has documented, for instance, in the organizational complex, the rise of the notion of pattern at the intersection of deep information structures and spatial formation. Pattern in the 1950s, it's where information becomes synonymous of spatial, but also social regularities. And this is Georgi Kepes' version of patterns, and this is the illustration he gives to Wiener to write an article in one of his books. And Reinhold has shown convincingly how this notion of pattern, combined with the influence of cybernetics, influences siren and corporate architecture. Strangely, dealing with patterns, the figure of Christopher Alexander still remains somewhat mysterious or understudied. But we're waiting, of course, and I'm sure that Molly will address that tomorrow, Molly's dissertation, to fill this gap. We are beginning to know better the type of relation between the corporate strategies of IBM, for example, and the use of architects like Saarinen, but also Eames, the Eames, Elliot Noyes, and John Howard's book, IBM and the Transformation of Corporate Design, is full of precious insight. And for example, the fact that the computer at the beginning is a spatialized machine. And Elliot Noyes is the guy, for example, who designs the computer as an environment. We are by now well aware of the relation between the megastructural movement and the computing perspective, something that is epitomized, for example, by Yona Friedman with his extraordinary flat writer, in which a computer would allocate space in the kind of spatial cities he envisaged. So to the right is the article in which he proposes that. We also know that Archigram and so many others were influenced by the computing perspective. This is Computer City by Archigram. Being at the CCA, no need to say how important is Cedric Price and how important it is to study Cedric Price, probably one of the major thinkers. And I still think that the audacity of the Generator project has not yet been reached again in the field of digital architecture. So there are studies of crucial places of teaching and research, like Cambridge in the 1960s and 1970s, where people as diverse as Leslie Martin, Leon March, Christopher Alexander, Bill Mitchell, Peter Eisenman, not to mention Tony Vidler and some others, were present, has begun. This is one of Yolande Mar's studies on the application of Boolean logic to architecture. By the same token, we're beginning also to know better what happened at MIT, and we're very again waiting for Molly's ultimate clarification on the architecture machine group. A lot of responsibility for tomorrow, Molly. Yeah. We are also beginning to know better, understand better what the Ulm School, for example, do in this story. We have the work of Ingeborg Rocker, or more recently, Andrew. So I could go on and on. There is almost every year a new kid on the block who wants to study that kind of thing. Just a couple of remarks on what these things shows. First, it reveals an extreme diversity of places and people. Not only North America, but the United Kingdom, Germany, France with people like Nicholas Schöffer, Italy with the experiments linked to the Milan Biennale, but also Croatia. One of Yves Blau's students recently has unearthed how important was Croatia at some point in this story. So a pretty widespread story, not to mention Japan and other places. Second, a lot of the questions we're currently dealing with as if they were brand new were already raised at the time. The question, for example, of code writing and the relation to design, central question in the 1960s, early 1970s. The computer has something that has to do with ambience, environment, what Rashid called the atmospheric. During this period, pretty much a lot of designers are aware of that, including, by the way, Buckminster Fuller, but also Archigram, the control and choice project is very linked to that. Speaking of the environmental, the sensory, the immersive, one should note, by the way, in this period, the intensity of the relation between architecture and the emerging electronic and later video arts, a connection that has not been yet fully restored. So a relation, of course, to media, and Beatriz Colomina's students have, of course, studied that. Probably for me, the most pervasive feature of the period is that people really did believe that the computer would not only draw, but actually really participate in the design process. And computer-aided design at the time was really in the sense of design. And we are barely beginning to recover this ambition today, after probably, I would say, 20 years of computer-aided drawing. We're barely beginning, and in many ways, Schumacher parametricism is very shy compared to the attempt at the time. Let me remind you that, for example, Negroponte believed deeply that the computer was supposed to be a partner in design. So I could go on and on. So let's not indulge into that and move on. Just to say a few things on the next period. That correspond roughly to the time frame of Greg's exhibition, the 1980s and early 1990s. So good news for the CCA, there are fewer contributions. This is a domain that has been less explored, that appears often as an interlude between yesterday and the present. Although it's, for example, a very crucial period in engineering. It's pretty well documented, and this is why Choisyo's project should actually probably more be replaced into the engineering computing technique evolution of the time. We know, of course, a certain number of things. The genealogy leading from deconstruction to folding in architecture and to the paperless studio. Mario Carpo, to mention him again, wrote an excellent paper in the revised edition of Folding in Architecture on that matter. We know now the part played by Eisenman in the early formulation of this particular agenda. What is less known, and in my opinion is a big subject, still to be explored, despite the fact there is a Portuguese student of MIT, Jos Rocha, who wrote an interesting dissertation dealing with that, is the link between postmodernism and the computing perspective. One of the reasons being that postmodernism was obsessed by the question of language, and that, of course, the computer appeared as the kind of perfect semiotic machine. And it's quite interesting. I'm sorry, I took my old edition of Project Architecture and Utopia, the French version. Tafouri, in the last chapter of Architecture and Utopia, evokes this new age when capitalism is no longer going to manipulate money, capital, but symbols through the computer. So this is a very important question around this. Now let's move again and towards the present, when we have end of the 1990s, early 2000s, etc., the rise of real computing in architecture, all the digital projects, the blobs, etc., etc. We all know the story with a number of key projects. I chose just a few then for the pleasure of the eye, or the non-pleasure of the eye, depending on your tastes. This is one thing to note. Lots of projects, lots of publication, mostly documented by architects. And we have a lot of theoretical writings by architects, beginning by things like books like Animate Form and going up to, for example, Lars Twibroek, Sympathy of Things. There have been relatively few historians trying to make sense of this very recent history. Let me mention at least Mario Carpo once again, Georges Testa, myself, and probably a few others. Why? Because of course it's very close to the present, and historians sometimes have difficulty with that. That things go very quickly. In the early 2000s, form was still a big thing. It was the time of the blobs and Lynn's animate form. Today, fabrication is the hottest subject. So things go very quickly. Parametricism is almost now declining. So it goes very quickly. The most pressing challenge may have, however, to do with the fact that this is a domain that raised theoretical questions, pretty massive theoretical question. As Bernard Tschumi noted, there is something that regards the very foundation of architecture that is at stake. So that from history, what it thus led to a blend between history and theory, if we choose to call theory something closer to a kind of, disciplinary question. So now what I'd like to do is evoke, without any pretension to be exhaustive, nor definitive, nor whatever historians are now no prophets, a few of the theoretical questions that seem to me on the table. So that's a partial view there, but that seems to me one of the couple of questions we have to raise, probably as much as historian as professional. So first thing to note, yes, I wanted also to mention that speaking of fabrication, the return of ornament is evidently linked to fabrication these days. So from history to theory. I mentioned a number of times the need to avoid techno-determinism. I think once again, and it has been said, the machine is not the ultimate cause. It's a revelator and probably an accelerator. Above all, the technology acts as a mediation between architecture and the social and cultural background that is shifting. In other words, this might be where I'm really very much a historian. I think what's primarily happening is a cultural change, a massive cultural change, and architecture has linked to that. So let me be precise. The aim is not to pass from techno-determinism to social determinism. Architecture is not a mere reflection of what's happening. What I would suggest rather is the idea of a co-evolution. Society and culture are changing, architecture is changing. A little bit like historian, the STS specialist Sheila Jazanov proposes for the relation between technology and society, the notion of co-production. So there might be a co-production of architecture, of architectural change and social change these days. So I will not develop, I've tried to inquire into some of these questions at length in digital culture and in the book on Ornament. I just want to note a few things. The first one is really a destabilization of a series of key notions of architecture. For example, I was really struck by the reluctance to talk about representation, which may have to do with a kind of radical destabilization of what we used to take for granted architectural form. So why? Because of course one of the questions these days is designing form the relevant question for architecture? People like Carl Chu will suggest that actually it's designing the DNA that may give birth to different form. So this has been a question with us since the Deleuze and Bernard Cache objectile question. Should we design form or design mechanism that trigger formations? There may be more profound reasons, so I won't deal with this as one of my obsession, but one has to do with the fact that in a dynamic and fluid world, like the one the computer proposes, form is no longer the crowning achievement of the design process, but rather something that appears as an instance, as an occurrence. To use an Eisenman approach, one could say that form is no longer synonymous, the Eisenman of the Derridian period, synonymous with stable presence. Form could be different. It's a frozen moment, and this explains the enduring fascination of the picture of Muybridge and Marais, as if architecture was the selection of a certain moment in a kind of theoretically limitless geometric and technological flow. One may go deeper, and I've tried to do that in the book on digital culture, and remark that after a philosopher, Pierre Lévy, who actually moved to Canada a few years ago, who wrote an interesting book some 20 years ago, stating that information is not a thing. A bit is not a thing. A bit is an occurrence. It's an elementary occurrence. It's an elementary event. And one could, in that respect, say that form in the digital world, form is not in the traditional mode of ontological mode of presence. Form happens. Form becomes commensurable with a form of action. And this is for me what is at the root of the performative turn. Why the performative turn in architecture? Because architecture becomes more thinkable as an action, as a thing. So this reluctance to use the term representation that we saw, for example, with Reinhold Martin, but with many others, may have to do with that. Is performance replacing representation as the perspective from which design must be approached? This is one of the questions we've seen again and again throughout the past week. Other thing that is becoming sometimes problematic, not with all designers, is scale. Because of course the digital information has no scale. It's something that does not exist, and I took this François Roche thing, which looked like a sponge, but it's actually supposed to be a city. And you not always know. Something that strikes me probably even more because of my kind of engineering roots is the crisis of tectonics. The crisis of a certain kind of attachment to structural legibility. That somebody like me, Michel Say, could tamper that much with a classical 1960 building in Paris is for me revealing something that is happening. Structure is no longer a clear guideline. That may account for the current obsession with stacking. Stacking as a kind of rejection of traditional tectonic modes. And we see so many stacking. I could have taken even Scott Cohen Tel Aviv Museum, which is also based on the same principle. So, at the same time, we have the so-called return of ornament, and more profoundly, a kind of blurring between structure and ornament, which is so different from what we used to know. And the Beijing Stadium, in the Beijing Stadium, the structure is partly ornamental, and this is a feature that characterized many contemporary projects. Last thing, and I regret that Oosterhuis is not here, another thing that is really at stake today is the relation to memory and history. And I'm really struck, and it's funny because I had actually already prepared the spaceship thing, but I had a Zahavi project, and yesterday I changed it. Why do we have so many spaceships? Probably because spaceships do not have history. And this is not so far from this kind of reality. So an architecture that is an architecture of the everlasting present, an architecture that has difficulty connecting with a clear past and a very different future. So this may have something to do with the crisis of tectonics insofar that one of the things that the computer promotes, and this is Georges Lejean who made this remark a few years ago, is that the type of project it creates are projects without parts. Parts are replaced with relation. And parts were what used to be revealed in the ruin. So we have projects which are hard to imagine ruined. Which was one of the classical exercises of architecture, was to imagine architecture as a ruin, which was a way to inscribe it in time. This has become difficult. So we're in the middle of a series of big questions. And what has struck me in the past 3-4 years is how this question of fundamentals is returning. Even with architecture, we're not usually suspect of that. For example, that Graham Poulas now is talking about the elements of architecture. That Bernard Tschumi is talking about the concept, the founding concept of architecture. There seemed to be the need to rethink what are the foundation, the changing foundation of the discipline. And of course, with a few guidelines, we pretty much know that materiality, a kind of more acute sense of materiality, linked to ornament, linked to many other things, to a kind of new tactile condition, may have something to do with the way we may recreate foundation. There are, for me, and in the book on ornament, I take a very clear stance on the necessity to reinvent the question of symbolism and meaning. So let's be clear, not meaning as something frozen, but architectural meaning as something that unfolds dynamically. In the old analogy between the body and the column, the column is never a body. The column is the suggestion of becoming a body, which is different. So what I'm suggesting, and probably behind the kind of dismissive attitude towards meaning that we have today among so many designers is because of postmodernism and the idea of frozen symbolism, forgetting that before that, architectural meaning was nothing, was certainly not frozen, it was something dynamic. So of course we have a lot of uncertainty, I could go on forever. For example, we don't know where fabrication is leading us. Are we really heading towards robotization as Gramazio and Kohler try so hard to convince us? Or is are robots just an epistemic condition enabling to rethink some of the fundamental architecture? There are many other questions. The link, for example, to the political and the social is not completely clear. There are links for sure. Digital architecture really developed at the time of globalization, at the time of the competition between cities, and everybody wanted to have its blob, and the later version. So there are links, but relatively few studies on that. To conclude and to go back again to my obsession with subjectivity, etc., I do believe, but you're not obliged to share it, that we're living a period of evolution of the discipline comparable to the Renaissance, a kind of radical rethinking of the foundation of architecture. And for me, it's interesting that the Renaissance rethought about building, invented the perspective as a new mode of what was called representation at the time, invented a lot of things, and also it was concrete with the invention of a new subject, a humanist subject. So for me, I don't believe anymore in the cyborg, perhaps, but what is the new subject of the emergent condition of architecture and society might be a good question these days. And this is the reason, once again, I started with this kind of endeavor. That's okay so far? Okay, so let's move on. A few things on the urban, just to mention actually the extent of the problem, and then I'll move towards conclusion. A couple of things on the urban. It's a huge problem, and I was really struck by a kind of glibness of Bernard Tschumi on this question. Like many digital architects, they do not seem to realize the gap between the two stories. So let's start from a number of evident things. It's absolutely evident that the rise of the society of information is linked to urban questions. It's actually one of the things that give birth to urbanism, or as a modern discipline. If you think the birth of urbanism is around the 1900s, in between there again the 1880s and etc., and is linked to the fact that now, in some ways, modern urbanism, it's when we begin to understand the city as a series of information flow, and something that is not reducible only to urban design, even within that, etc. So then, the story, so this is, for example, the statistical atlas of the city of Paris in the 1880s, done by actually cousins of the Bertillon of the anthropological measurements. The Bertillon cousins were actually at the head of the statistical bureau of the city of Paris. So you have this very important link. And I would say that in many ways, pretty much all the periods that I've been evoking, my three-tiered story of from the information to the digital, is linked to urban evolution. Another very evident thing is what happens in the 1950s and 1960s, and up to in which we see a direct attempt to apply cybernetics and system theory to urbanism. And this is something that is partially only documented in Jennifer Light's book, and there have been a couple of other unpublished stories on that. We now know that in the evolution of urban debates in the 50s and 60s up to the 70s, these things were crucial. This is, for example, Melville Branch, and this is the project of a kind of control room to plan Los Angeles in the 1960s. Melville Branch had worked, he was trained as a planner, worked for a big corporation dealing with armament project, missile project, ballistic missile, and then design a control room for this company, and then design a control room for the city of Los Angeles. So you can see what you have behind is the dream of the cybernetic city and the system city. Do not forget that New York was at certain point, the RAND Corporation was super active in New York and Los Angeles. So there are a lot of connections. It's a fundamental story because if you don't understand that period, you don't understand why actually planning divorced from architecture. And cybernetic and system theory were a failure in the 60s and early 70s, but they contributed to the divorce between the planning profession in the US and architecture. Because, you know, the planners were doing models, for example, of traffic, all these kinds of things, which were so non-architectural. So as an answer, urban design developed, and we know the story, but the story is linked to the development of computing and these kind of information and computing thing. So one of the things that is striking is there is a kind of return of the repressed, and the smart city phase is partly marked by a massive return of the cybernetic dream. When IBM, Cisco, and others want to design control rooms for cities, this is, for example, for Rio de Janeiro, we see the return of the same temptation. One thing is sure, there are very few relations these days between the smart city researchers and what's going on in architecture. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem. That is not absolutely, and it's not project like the parametric Zahadi project for Singapore who really connect the two. Neither, by the way, all the augmented reality pasting screen on facade is not really the most important thing these days. One of the reasons being that, you know, if the city is a screen, it's the fifth screen, it's no longer a screen on the facade, it's a screen on the phone. So that's a bit more difficult to think in architectural terms. Doesn't mean there are not possibilities of connection. One, for example, that was explored by Mirko at the CCA a few years ago is, for me, the sensory dimension. You know, both the smart cities and digital architecture have in common this very strong tactile kind of dimension, and there are other dimensions that would deserve exploration. The problem we have is, however, that digital technology, contrary to the automobile and many other technology, does not have a very clear impact on the urban form. It's not like the automobile. The automobile changed immediately the urban form, and architects like Le Corbusier and so many moderns heralded these changes. Digital technology, the impact is not clear at all. Even, you know, I remember, you know, people like Bill Mitchell in City of Bits evoking a kind of green condition of the city, etc. It has not happened so far. And the concrete, spatial, what happens very often today is that the urban experience is fundamentally changed. The city is reinterpreted. It's mapped, for example, in a very different way. Urban cartography is evolving very rapidly, but the urban form is not, so far, deeply changed. So we need probably to reconnect, and history might be, by the way, a good way to explore a certain number of questions. So I'm reaching the end of this lecture, and I'd like to return really to this question of history and the challenges, because one of the reasons I got it, I may explain a little bit why did I, starting from so many researchers on 17th, 18th, and early 19th century stuff, became interested in the digital. Probably because I was interested actually in a period in which rapid technological and cultural change intersect with architectural and urban issues. And I studied at length for the first part of my career what happened between, let's say, 1750 and 1850 in relation to industrialization. I have very often the impression that something as massive is happening today, and that it's worth at least looking a little bit at what's going on. So the histories of the digital, all these histories raise a series of classical historical problems. For example, we have problems of periodization. I have proposed, I think, for example, in the first period, rise of the Society of Information, and the second period, emergence of the computer, is very clear. When does the digital really takes over is a more complex question. You may begin in the 1970s, or you may begin in the 1990s. 20 years for an historian is a very long period of time, and it changes completely the perspective. So how do we periodize is a complex question. Another classical question, and I think here with all these things around the paperless studio, I think it's a good question to ask oneself, is what role to the avant-garde or neo-avant-garde, or a movement that pretend themselves as neo-avant-garde, vis-a-vis more widespread evolutions. To be clear, the paperless studio was not the only one. It was, of course, much publicized, and I think Bernard got it really to the core in some ways when you say it enabled a new generation of architects to express themselves. But we shouldn't forget that the paperless studio would not have existed if there was not this huge network of things. So should we write in history still centered on avant-garde? And should we transform Greg Lynn into this kind of avant-gardist hero? Or should we write a different history? Then what becomes his role? You know, all these questions are questions for the historians today. And they're complex question, not easily solved, which doesn't mean that, you know, Animate Form was a worldwide bestseller, so it's not the problem. It's more trying to see how do we write the history. So that's another typical question. I've retained really from the exhibition, because I think it's one of the great, you know, for me, the great aspect of the exhibition, the need to connect to an archaeology, which has been, you know, at the forefront of historical inquiries in the history of science, for example, with the history of machines. Take Peter Gallison and his interest in the concrete processes and machines, apparatuses, experiments. So I think we need, and the digital, this is something we've not enough done in architecture. We've of course integrated the history of the construction site as much as we could, but it's, you know, Reinhold was not, well, he was doing his little pitch, as we all do, so when it was saying nobody ever did representation history, it was a bit far-fetched. What is true, however, is that we have so little by the end about the history of material production, the material condition of design. It's true, not necessarily representation, but the material condition, what kind of paper, what kind of pencils? You know, I'm, for example, one of the last representatives of the Rotring generation. You know, with a typical problem of the ink that was dripping sometime, and the 06 that became a 08, all these problems we had, and the zip period. I don't think anyone has ever, among the younger ones, have ever used zip. And you know, all these things. Why is it that we're still writing such an idealistic history of architecture? I think the exhibition is a powerful statement on the need really to reconnect. You know, even the FedEx envelope, it's so true that the FedEx did change a number of processes in architecture, not to speak of the internet. So that's for me definitely something. This history, and I hope I was clear on that, needs for me to be connected to lots of other histories. Art history, of course, you know, I mentioned media art, electronic art. You cannot understand what's happening in the 1950s and 1960s in architecture if you don't think of the electronic art, if you don't think of places where art and architecture intersect. But this is probably still true today. But we know that media history is probably as important, media theory and media history. Social history, we don't have enough of that, although the digital and the social are still interconnected. We need above all to connect to the urban dimension. Once again, it's a major issue these days. That was, of course, the paperless studio, the archaeology. I took this one on the web, and the urban. I think the greatest challenge for me is probably the following, that if we write this history, it's impossible not to deal with very contemporary questions that have to do with the definition of the profession. If you write these days, you know, on Giulio Romano and the problem of mannerism, you are not completely obliged to deal with what's going on in the profession. If you deal with even what's happening in the 1950s and exit, must be a ghost in the machine somewhere. Looks like Ghostbusters.
The machine disagrees.
Yeah. If you look at what's happening in the 1950s, you have to do. Really not that one. Whose phone is it?
The phone is hiding itself.
Yes.
I really loved it. I thought, you know, there was like Blockbuster, you know, they're going to be, you know, that's the kind of music you hear in the film at some point. Okay, let's return to historiographic issues. When you deal with even relatively remote moment of the digital, you have to deal with professional questions of today. So the problem is, in some ways, how to both write a history that is linked to social history, political history, etc., and at the same time a history which is intimately linked to the discipline. In other words, in historical terms, how to be both external and internal. You have this classical opposition in history between external, that is something that relates art, science, architecture, you name it, to the social political issues, etc. And internal, you do the history of the discipline. I think today we have to do both at the same time, and this is not very clear. Because of that, we have to find a new answer to this relatively old question of what is the role of history in design, without returning to the postmodern or the tendenza or whatever. We're no longer in the time of Rossi, so this is not the right answer, but I showed that just to mention that problem. That strangely, it's a moment in which we may have to reconnect history to the question of design. And what part, of course historians should be first and foremost historians, not designers, and without any pretension to tell to the designers what they have to do, this is not our role. But we should find a new regime, a new economy of the relation between history and design education, mostly design education. So I will conclude on that. What I found interesting ultimately in the digital as an historian, so of course the material is fabulous and this is a massive evolution, etc. But it obliges us to rethink about the content of history and the status of history vis-a-vis the profession and the professional education. And I think, if only for that reason, that would be a really interesting question. Thank you very much.
Which kind of history? In the sense that I'm very happy that you reacted in this way to this, how can I say, archaeological approach, which is archaeological but is also very ideologically framed. But being part of this discussion as history and re-describing, you can write and define a lot of different history at the same time now. In the sense that all these histories that you can write now, they are inevitably very operative because they will shape the discussion in a certain direction or in another one. So that is for me very interesting because it is a kind of role that history has not, history architecture has not had in the second part of the 20th century.
The postmodern one, you had a very strong. What I'd like to avoid, however, is returning to a kind, I have great sympathy for some of the question of meaning, for example. I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of questions that postmodernism raised, and very little sympathy for the answer it gave to those questions. For example, I think we have to find a way for history not to try to tell designers what they should do or what is, more to kind to use the professional question as a way to question the historical discipline, which is slightly different. And then, to be more questioned by what comes from the practice, and to use it not to become, super doctrinal person. I don't think this is the aim, but rather to rethink our role. And then we can have a more active role in the pedagogy as people who, reveal problem. What I'm hostile to is the idea that we would come as a super knowledgeable guy and say that's good, that's not good, etc. I don't think, first of all, that it would work, and second, so that's still for me something I'm working on. What is the new operativity of history, which is different from the postmodern stance, etc. It might have to do for me also to the question of meaning, to try to remind architects that they have by the end to be socially relevant. Really struck me yesterday about Mies, the conversation between the vision of Cass about Mies, that he forgot also that Mies was rooted in history, and that and that, by the way, the problem of the angle is a very old problem in architecture, beginning with the Doric order, and that actually Mies because he knew still very well what was the Doric order, he could fully appreciate also that it had changed. I think in some ways also my answer would be architecture is a discipline, but it's also a tradition. Tradition means that a tradition is not about what you keep, it's as much about what you change, what you abandon. And I think strangely, for me, the operativity of history would be to help designers to know what they have to abandon, not necessarily what they have to keep.
A question about the digital as you say, as a condition, because quite often computers seem to be described as a grain or mushrooms, as a natural phenomenon that occur without any economical and political agenda behind them, as a given that is surrounding us. And I wonder, what about computers as a commodity? What about computer as a mean of organization of labor? How that is playing in a way towards attention?
There are various ways to address that. You know, as we all know, for example, the computer, where up to the mid-1970s, as far as we remember, they were massively financed by the military. So they're linked. And you know, you have the studies on the CNC, the invention of the CNC, early computer numerically controlled machines, and the link it has to a certain political, pretty conservative political agenda, etc., etc. First of all, for me, the computer, we are fetishizing too much the computer these days. So I think the computer is part of a much broader array. Once again, if you look around us, you know, the cell phone is as important. The smartphone is as much part, and if you think, for example, the urban, you know, the smartphone is probably a more powerful urban machine than the computer, more and more. So we have to stop fetishizing about the computer. Then it's true that for me the digital is linked to a number of political issues. But it begins with the society of information. The society of information, for example, begins to completely isolate people who process information to people who do things with stuff, with things. And you take terrorism, you know, scientific management. One tends to forget that scientific management is based on information. You have to have all this data. And you separate the people who process the data from the people in the workshop. And actually, the information society is already, you know, completely linked to political and social choices, and it has gone up to today.
Yeah. I like the notion of archaeology, and I was particularly struck by your notion that to push an inquiry as to how space was controlled by machines without things with computers in the narrow sense of the word computer. So you were showing, I think, you were showing a plant which were electrical plants.
Yeah.
Where, and I think that the idea of mapping out as a form of archaeology, you know, how and when machines were controlling space. And I think that the phone, not the smartphone, but the phone period, has always been an early invention where a machine controls space. And I think also one of your students was working on the development of hospitals, which has never been part of any history of the digital, but in fact that machines were actually controlling the way space was planned, used, etc. as hospitals. So that the archaeology for me seems to be a very interesting method. And by the way, to add on the methodological notion, and a comment that the archaeology, of course, is very embedded in postmodern strategies. Fury, Foucault, I mean, all of these. I think the way we do history mostly is really has been elaborated first in the 70s and 80s. So the history that we do today is very much the type of history that has been initiated in what we call postmodern context. We may not have the Marxist reading like the Fury has, but we certainly have the ideological kind of underpinning and the kind of inquiries that were set at that time. Foucault, of course, still, in my opinion, dominates largely.
It's very specific to architecture, that's the Foucault domain. I was a Foucauldian myself, you know, my first book is so Foucauldian sometimes.
But the notion of archaeology comes from...
I'm embarrassed.
The notion of archaeology comes from genealogies.
Yeah, what is probably different today is probably because I as much an influence on the history of science, and there have been, we bear the name of people like Latour, and through Latour actually to a kind of Deleuzian layer, which has reshaped a little bit.
I'm quite aware of that. But
Yeah,
within the field of architecture, the Foucault paradigm is.
Oh, it's still present for sure, because what we're so often interested in is the how discourse and objects, dispositif,
Yes.
do have a relation one to another. But I think the hospital is a great example. There are actually many instances before digital architecture of how information is linked to the material world.
Or spatial.
Yeah, although the problem of the digital is that with the urban, we don't have, once again, the phone, by the way, is a good example. The phone had relatively little impact on the urban form. The cable car did, etc., but, you can write a history of Los Angeles from cable car companies, tramway, how do you call that, streetcar, sorry, companies, etc. You cannot write a history of Los Angeles from the phone only. It's more complicated.
The phone, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's part of the complexity, but yes, otherwise it would. Yeah.
I wonder if the I'm going to try to find fetishization of the computer that you refer, kind of tendencies around the computer have kind of ended on an aesthetics of complexity, which are and if this has ended since we worked with last Ornament, I'm thinking of using information as ornament.
I think ornament today, if you want to understand it, they're multi-level. Well, what I've tried to show in the book that it's a very, again, complicated thing. One thing is sure, information and materiality have a deep link today. And this is where we're the inheritor of the pattern age. The idea that information is what actually makes visible, and which is actually not so new. Ornament was always in the Baroque era, etc. One of where the material was at its most visible. So that's not completely new. But ornament, information, and materiality have a link decidedly today. I'm not sure the aesthetics of complexity. It's not only complexity. I think there is, for example, for me the most fundamental thing is a kind of radical questioning of the difference between subject and object, which is what I explain at length in the book. And I think this is why the theme of affect has taken such an importance in contemporary architecture. So complexity, yes, but everything. We now know that things are complex. So this is pretty much the condition in which we live. So it's almost, a kind of subliminal thing in the world. Yes or yes? Yeah.
What's your take about the categories that constitute the so-called fundamentals of architecture? Because it seems that we keep using this term, and maybe we don't know exactly what we mean, or each of us has a different idea as to what the fundamentals of architecture may be. And sort of related to that, do you think it is a matter of rethinking what corresponds to received categories? So, in other words, a kind of thematic criticism problem, or rather it is more of a sidestepping. In other words, it's more a matter of stopping using certain received categories and try to come up with a new terminology to describe new problems.
Okay, you like simple questions. I tried to give a simple answer. First of all, I don't believe at all in the Koulas approach. That's to say, I don't think the corridor, the toilet, and the balcony, or whatever, I don't remember. Because he forgets, what really struck me with Koulas is that he didn't think of the traditional elements of architecture like the columns. So what is for me interesting with the column is strangely that it's the most difficult thing to define. In Alberti, the column is sometimes structural, sometimes ornamental. And it's very common throughout the Renaissance and Baroque age that the column varies from being a structural elements to an ornamental. So then what interests me in the column is that it's both a pretty geometrically defined kind of thing, but at the same time a very ambiguous thing to interpret. So then what interests me then is that the pilaster is actually part of the language of the column. And the pilaster is definitely not a column, it's just a salient thing. But it's a becoming column of the world. And then I would suggest that the real problem of the elements, and this is where Durand did a very bad trick on us, was to reduce elements to a collection of fixed figures. Whereas elements should be a collection of dynamic, almost morphogenetic, emergent properties. So that by the end, almost, I'm sorry to have to confess that, but I almost come back to a kind of Rickwurtian understanding of the column as an emergent property. So, and then, if we begin to think of elements as emergences, not as fixed things, then the digital may give us, then the fold could be an element, by the way, and not a fixed thing, because the fold is never a thing. And the initial, one of the things that, this was one of the dimensions that interested initially Deleuze, that the fold is not a fixed figure. You don't even know where it stops, where it begins. So then, in some ways, once you've understood that on the order, you may begin to rethink perhaps the question of elements in a more dynamic way. That's at least my take. But certainly not as a fixed. The big postmodern error was to take the column as something you could cut and paste, and hence the fascination for the kind of architecture of Durand, etc. And forgetting that, in some ways what makes Renaissance and Baroque architecture at its best something fantastic is the kind of vibration, pulsation of the architecture. So that would be my answer, if you like.
I had a historiographical question. You spoke before about the question of periodization, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think the digital affects another question, which is the relationship between center and periphery? Because across the presentation, I had the impression that you focus very much on the digital as a media history or as a history of technology. But I was wondering how...
In geographic terms?
Yeah.
Like, center and suburban, that kind of question?
But also in terms of, the capital and the colony or so forth. So basically all the post-colonial world in the
post-colonial history is not my specialty, to be honest, but let's start by what I know already. You take, for example, the center periphery. Some 20 years ago, at the time Bill Mitchell, or let's say at the time of City of Bits, etc., lots of people wrote about the kind of radical decentralization that the digital would allow. The kind of thing, to be truly contemporary would be to be playing on the stock exchange in Maine, or in a shack in Maine, or that kind of idea. What has happened is that, of course, some people have delocalized, but a lot of things have been relocalized, and this is the Saskia Sassen kind of stuff. I do think, in some ways, you have the splintering urbanism book of Graham, etc. I do think part of the story they tell is true. Although I don't think they're, again, let's not fetishize, because they tend to fetishize a little bit too much the digital. I think what's happening is actually something much broader. It's that we see a fractalization of spatial differences, we see that kind of thing, and you take the colonial relation, the traditional colonial post dimension has been replaced by a kind of fractalization of power structures. So that's more the way, nothing original in that vision, I'm aware, but that would be the way I would see it. Which creates, of course, severe geographic problems. For example, you take the map of, very concrete problems, the map of poverty around Paris has become something very hard to interpret. Whereas we used to have the simple east, northeast for, it's more complicated.
Do you think that the urban issues could be a good point to start with, to try to question, how can I say, the theories of some of architectural investigations and the technophilia of another kind of these because in a certain way the center of that question is you're questioning a much more let's say larger system of relationships, while both of these two systems, they are in a certain way, these two approaches are in a certain way trying to create a closed system inside which to develop a much more sophisticated valuation system. So if you break that kind of attitude to bring inside the urban, that could be an interesting issue to deal, an interesting problem to be raised. I bring this because one thing that struck me when in Zurich there was this kind of, even before Greg, to have the visiting professor position. It was an incredible effort to develop this kind of research on the urban situation, and in abandoned because the complexity that implies in this kind of urban issues, if you didn't want to do a very reductive approach that was by itself considered evident that it was too much reductive, were impossible to deal with. So then it was very interesting. I think that Zurich then shifted from these kind of urban issues to very specific architectural experimentation, because it was the only field in which it was the possibility of this kind of controlled environment.
I think we need to reintegrate the urban for various reasons. One is that despite classics, etc., I still think that there is something like a context in architecture that it's sometimes necessary. Second, if you look at star architecture is one of the fundamental motives. There are two motives why we have star architecture. One is globalization and the fact that there is a growing competition between cities. So if city A has an Herzog and Neuron museum, city B will have a Kulas auditorium, and city C a Zaha, whatever. But that's so actually, even though when they say they're not contextual, it's actually totally contextual and linked to urban issue. You take away the urban competition today, you take away star architecture. So that's in itself a bit past me. Second question that is for me, that I've said again and again from book to book, which is I think there is a huge political problem. That's to say, how could you, political and social problem. The digital has been more often used to design Prada shops than to do social housing. And if you look what's going on massively in China, etc., not much digital. At the same time, one of the reasons also architects, star architects do what they do is because there is a deep crisis of planning. So when you don't have plans, you have scenario. And you use architect to produce striking images that trigger scenario effect. Herzog and Neuron are probably, they don't understand the damn thing about the city. But the fact that they can be asked by cities to do planning doesn't mean that the cities believe they're good planners. It means that one of the functions of architects today is to trigger scenario, which is one of the things Gehry did magnificently with Guggenheim. The Guggenheim became the Guggenheim not only because it was a striking form itself, but because it triggered a whole virtuous scenario of the city that used to be industrial and came back as a postmodern metropolis, etc. That's what people are expecting from architecture. So for these reasons, I think the production of architecture is actually inseparable from cities, etc., but totally acritical. Because very often the worst than being acontextual is that actually architects, they are totally acritical with this question of the urban. At the same time, when they work is totally dependent on urban strategies, rivalries, etc., etc. So I think there is a huge problem. I do agree.
And I think you look at the history of this Montreal, urban planners in the 1960s, Chicago, about the same time. Disappears, of course, by the 1990s. And also you start to get change, the separation of fiscal planning from political planning. That is, rules of planning. So IIT separates planning, fiscal planning, from fiscal planning, gets rid of, say, bureaucratic planning. And Harvard does the same thing.
Exactly. I was about to say Harvard followed exactly the same trajectory.
Exactly. So, there's something happening there.
Yeah, my point is actually, in some ways, it's not only to go back to physical planning, but to go back to a real presence of architecture, within, the concrete physical, the concrete making of the city, more than planning the making of the city, instead of making isolated piece. Because what makes me, cast piece in Budapest makes me nervous in some ways. It's not about the quality of the object, it's about what do you do when you're just coming to a city to put a wing or whatever, and the city goes on. I think it's an abdication, whatever one say, of what was part of the ambition of architecture to be part of the making of cities.
What's that thinking? That extraordinary plan was announced in Paris a couple of years ago, destroying all the Paris.
Well, interestingly, there were actually two things going on, because I know both sides, and there were a lot of people, engineers, etc., saying, we're amusing the architects so that they produce nice images, but the real issue is transportation, and let's not consult the architect on that. And what I'm advocating in some ways that, why not rethink again of the place architecture could really have in even rethinking transportation systems, like Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's, for me, one of the great limits these days of digital architecture, is that strangely it's completely disengaged from infrastructure. We have all this discourse on infrastructure and a total disengagement of architecture from infrastructure and all other things.
Why do you think there is all of this anxiety around representation, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks? And the couching of maybe in terms of visualization, but representation, which just seemed to be so central only a couple of years ago, seems to be a term that's used with anxiety, as you pointed out.
I think it has to do for me with form. I do think that something very fundamental is for me, one of the less evident notions in my book on the digital is what happens when you begin to think of architecture as action. And then, and then the question of representation becomes non-relevant in some ways. And I think this is what has happened in many ways for many people. I do believe actually it's an illusion. That's to say, I do believe that we need to reinvent something. Sometimes I do believe that a lot of things are going to change, but we still need to reinvent something that would play a little bit the same function. So let's assume that representation is dead, then what do we put at that place? And for me that's one of the questions, which has to do also with the anxiety of images. It was very striking how by the end there is a growing anxiety about computer imagery. And I find it almost nostalgic, It was almost, I had never thought about the nostalgia of how do you call the schéma filaire, when you have the, how do you call that? When you have just, the skeleton with the threads.
Wireframe.
The frame. That you had the nostalgia of the framework. And that was for me the extraordinary things, that you had all this nostalgia. Which sometimes, people who write a lot, sometimes you may have a slight nostalgia of word 2 or word 3. But that was so powerful, because probably images are in a kind of unbridled status. Yes?
Antoine, let's go back to, you raised the question of some theoretical question. And among them, you mentioned scale and method. I mean, I see those two questions as, I mean, essential for this juncture between the rhetoric of the form, the digital, and the city. Specifically, when I think about historical city, the old fabric. I mean, there I see that there is no way of finding a dialogue. Or am I going too far? Cutting.
I think it's a problem even for architecture. You know, I always like Barbaro's characterization, one of Barbaro's definition of architecture as a reasoned meditation of use, which means a reasoned meditation of itself. I think what always struck me, you know, I taught in engineering school as well as in architecture school, in both cases history. What always struck me is that engineers do not, at the bottom, need history. But architects, even if they dislike history, they don't go to history classes, and they have to say, hey guys, you know, I'm going to low pass you or whatever, do something horrible with your grade if you don't show up at some point. But they still need, I think this is where I think we're in a deep moment of crisis, because, and it's not because I'm an historian, it's really because I believe very profoundly that history, that architecture is a reflexive discipline that takes itself as a subject of meditation. That Mies, for example, always strike me how Mies can be both totally revolutionary, and he's clearly not making Greek temples, but he has this rich legacy, etc. And I think today we're in the middle. For me, this is the ultimate crisis. The question of the relation to memory, to sedimentation, etc. And strangely, one of the things I dislike with discarding meaning is because meaning ages, but meaning then takes its place in memory. You know, just strangely, spaceship, rust, they don't age. You know, spaceship, at the end, it happens at the end of Independence Day. At the end of Independence Day, usually when the Americans do triumph on the extraterrestrial invaders, they just get broken and in little pieces. They don't age gracefully. And I think we have perhaps, not everything, because, you know, contextually, I'm not so shocked, for example, you know, Peter Cook and Fournier, grass building, you know, with this kind of Baroque-ish quality, goes well with a certain kind of historic setting. I'm not sure it's always a problem of the form. I think it's deeper than that. It's linked to the need to recognize that if you want to, for me, but that's probably because I work also like Martin in the 19th century, I really believe that if you want to have a future different from the present, you need to relate to the past.
More questions or comments? I know that tomorrow morning we have a kind of roundtable with 4 PhD students. I mean, leading the conversation. You have quite a group. Yes, go ahead.
Why history played a very important role in the School of Architecture for a certain period of time, say around the 80s, was a really important critical component of the discussions. So how history, and I have no problem in sustaining the necessity of a history today, because I think that the role that
at the CCA it would be difficult to, because why the CCA if memory and history do not matter, you know?
But the point that was raised that why history, if you look at the relevance in the program of the different schools of architecture, both in Europe and here, you see the decline of the relevance of the history in the
answer
of architecture. What, how do you?
The answer is not mysterious. First of all, you know, we just, you know, we've had one of the most fantastic decades in terms of technological change. You know, so architects were so busy, you know, dealing with a computer, beginning to think of sustainability. You know, there were a lot of things, globalization, etc. So not a lot of time for the self-reflection. So there, you know, there are times like that, just like. So that was the first reason. Second reason, I think historians in some ways disconnected, and I think it's also the fault of historians sometimes, that, you know, if you accept to teach in a design school, you have also to accept to be teaching. What I'm very often advocating, and in a design school, you've got to be an historian, or otherwise you're really going to be unhappy, because if you wanted to be a designer, be a designer, but not an historian by default. But at the same time, be an historian who is interested really in design. Otherwise, you also get unhappy. And you have to relate. For me, Banham, God knows how Banham sometimes was a bit oversimplifying, but Banham, you know, was a good example of somebody who dealt deeply with design issues. And I think it's also the fault, you know, it's also the fault of a certain professionalization of historians. That we became professionals, we got all these PhD and super PhD and post PhD and whatever, and we forgot a little bit that we have to deal with design. And of course it was the fault of the arrogance of designers, but guess what? Designers are usually arrogant, so you've got to deal with it. But I think it's really the conjunction between a very rapid series of evolution that was really time-consuming for design, and a professionalization of history that tended to forget that if you choose to teach in a design school, you're not in the history of art department. For example, I do think you're going to be unhappy if you wanted to be in an American Civ or history of art department and you end up in a design school, you're going to be unhappy. If you should be happy to be in a design school because you're close to a profession that is doing things. And if you're interested in the history of people who do things and how things are done, etc., then it's a fantastic place. God knows how the GSD can be the bullshittiest, sorry, it's a lovely place on earth, but it's a fantastic place to know what's going on. And you know, who is doing what, and you know, it's like, you know, kind of permanent, you know, continuing education place in terms of what's going on in the world. So you've got to like that. If you don't like that, go to a history of art department. That would be my answer.
I don't disagree with you at all. On the professionalization of historians as one of the problems.
But at the same time, I think historians have to be professional historians. If you're not recognized, and I always say also that at the same time, the difficulty is that if you're a historian in a design school and historians do not take you seriously, you have a problem too. So,
Yes.
yeah, you have to be, this is what I call being both externalist and internalist. I think it's a real challenge.
With the advent of the historian in design school, is, you know, you have no historian at all for the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, it was kind of after the war. And then the historians in the design school were amateurs at the terrible level. And then you started getting PhD programs that were, and in the design school is very different from the art schools.
Absolutely. And actually, I think one of the reasons also we have to continue is that actually architecture, to be clear, architecture is disappearing from the history of art programs very rapidly. You take Harvard, you know, this is really a shrinking domain in the history of art, and Harvard is not the only place. So we're going to end up being the only historians of architecture in design school, etc. So
the other thing to say is that, you know, for someone who has lived this period from the 1980s when I graduated until now, and I'm historian, I've been teaching this for 30 years at this point, it is completely installed as the part. What I've noticed this time is that the historians are now there, they're in place. They might not be at the apex of what people are interested in, but they're there. And the PhD students, by and large, PhD students do historical work. They might be working in the 60s, on the 60s, 70s, 80s, instead of the Enlightenment and, you know, the Renaissance like it was in the 80s and 90s. But essentially, PhDs are by and large historical documents. There's very little project-based PhDs. There's very little theoretical reflection, pure theoretical reflection on architect's PhDs. You're well placed to.
I know, but I don't disagree. I think, however, that we cannot go on forever having 90% of what we call PhD in School of Architecture being historians. And God knows that I have nothing against historians, but I do think that this is unsustainable on the long term. So we need to diversify the programs. for a simple reason is that, you know, why would only the historians, etc. That's it, I agree. We have a presence. It's really striking how we are a presence in architecture school. I remember a conversation with Sackler, and Sackler telling me that Gropius received it once and said, you know, we don't need history at Harvard. I think we're no longer there. It's not a reason to think that it's smooth and we're perfect. I think we have a lot of things to improve.
It is a number.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you included the urban in this function, and you've heard that from anybody else. At one point, you said that the urban has made, digital has made a significant impact on the urban.
On the urban form.
On the urban form.
Not on the urban.
What do you think about geospatial information and GIS data and how that may have catalyzed and reinforced?
That I even say, if you remember, that actually it has changed deeply urban maps, urban cartography. I think it has changed two things so far. The urban experience of every day in deep, close relation to urban mapping and urban cartography. Speaking of representation, it's quite interesting that nobody wants to talk about representation in the architectural realm, whereas everybody's talking about representation in cities. I was, you know, now I'm traveling now and then to French towns, and Rennes, for example, Strasbourg, Montpellier, they all have 3D representation of the city, in which they can put new projects to show to the people of the city. You can move in the 3D model, etc. So there are lots of things going on in terms of that. It was really the build form. You know, it hasn't changed so far the layout of the streets. Streets are more dependent on car and sewers than they're dependent on digital stuff. Even if, for example, antennas are becoming a problem in Paris, because there is such a saturation and there are never enough antennas for the 4G generation phone. So that's the problem.
I absolutely agree. I'm thinking about these as a tool set. So, for instance, companies like IBM and Siemens using GIS data as a way to inform design decisions.
I agree, but it's not changing. Let's say we haven't seen, you know, the computer has definitely introduced a new realm of geometric possibilities, of ambiances. There are a number of things we were not able to do without computers, pre-computer. Or it was extremely difficult, and even it has changed fabrication. You know, I don't believe in a non-standard and a generalized condition, but it's true that, you know, customized, pretty sophisticated fabrication is a reality. In terms of the city, you know, the main problem of any urban guy is where are the sewers going to go, etc. You know, and the cables are relatively small. Even if the internet, I don't know whether you read these, you know, Bloom's books, Tubes, about the internet. It is a problem, of course, but it's a small problem compared to a sewer system. And India, for me, is quite interesting that in India, you find a lot of cell phones, and you can, in New Delhi, you have an electronic ticket. And funny story, you know, there was a couple of guys tried to lure me into believing that since it was India, I didn't have a valid e-ticket to take the train to Chandigarh, and actually it was a perfectly functional e-ticket, etc. But toilets are a huge problem. So I would say, you know, urban problems today, it's more toilets than cell phones.